Hello everybody, my name is Fariba, and welcome back to my channel, The Medieval Reader. So today I want to talk about a book that I read last year. It's Revelation of Love by Dame Julian of Norwich. So the reason why I want to talk about this book is because medieval spiritual writings are often characterized as being really dark, dealing a lot with sin, with hell, with the wrath of God, and there is some of that in this work. But this was a very surprising read for me, because she talks about a lot of other things, like God as a mother figure. She talks about how God does not abandon people despite any sins they commit in their life. And what I think is particularly surprising is that this book survived at a time when Inquisitors were heresy hunting. So in the 14th century in England, John Wycliffe was writing against the Catholic Church. He was very critical of the friars, whom he felt had really betrayed the gospel. Here they were claiming to live in poverty, to not have possessions, but in reality they were some of the wealthiest people in Europe. And so his inquisitor, Thomas Netter, was going after John Wycliffe at the same time as Julian was writing these showings. And as it says in the introduction to this book, if Netter had come across this book, and I will mention why later, if he had come across this book, he would not have looked kindly on its content. But as you can tell, I have quite a lot of notes here, so I will try to be as brief and as concise, but as clear as possible. If there are any questions that you have over this material, make sure to ask me in the comments. If I make any mistakes, please correct me. I don't want to be communicating false information. So, anyway, let's begin. Julian of Norwich was an anchorite, and so anchorites were often women who would lock themselves in one cell in a convent. So there's usually two types of monastic life. There's eremitic life, which is the life of a hermit, somebody who lives by him or herself in a cave. And then there's cenobitic life, which is life in community. And the anchorite is somewhere in between. She lives in a convent, but she lives in her own cell. So she lives a solitary life in a larger community. And so this was Julian, and while she was very, very ill, she had 16 visions, or showings as they're called. And each of these showings are very theologically rich. They tell us something about 14th century spirituality, and particularly about forgiveness and God's love for humanity. And so this is actually, like I said, a very comforting book. When she recovered, she probably had a theologian who helped write down her showings. She was probably illiterate, which might mean that she couldn't actually write in Latin. That's oftentimes what being illiterate meant. It didn't necessarily mean that you couldn't read at all or that you couldn't write at all, but that you couldn't read or write in Latin. But this is a really good introduction to mystical writing. It's not too eccentric because it is very anthropological. There's a lot of emphasis on humanity and human nature, so that's very relatable. It's not too spiritual, and that is also what makes Julian's mysticism very relatable and very human. So the first place I want to begin is with an image that she has in one of her early showings. So the Lord comes to Julian and shows her something that is very small, the size of a hazelnut. And she starts to wonder what this could possibly mean. And so this is what she writes. The answer came. This is all that is made. I felt it was so small that it could easily fade to nothing, but again I was told, this lasts, and it will go on lasting forever because God loves it. And so it is with every being that God loves. That's one of the major themes in Julian's writing, is that all of creation, in comparison to the divine, is really small. Humanity in particular. Especially at a time when people believed in original sin, humans are born really sinful, they have adopted the sin of Adam, they're definitely not worthy of God's love. And yet, despite that, despite how tiny, despite how meaningless humanity, all of creation might be, God still loves humanity and the entirety of creation. And I think that's a really comforting message, and definitely was surprising to me when I first encountered it in this work. But there are other surprises as well. Julian also talks about God using feminine imagery. When people do that today, some people are like, oh, this is so radical, we can't use feminine imagery to talk about God. But Julian did this in the 14th century, so here's what she says. Just as a mother may allow her child to fall sometimes, and be distressed in various ways for its own benefit, yet she would never let any kind of harm come to the child for the love she bears it. And even though some earthly mother might allow a child of hers to perish, our heavenly mother, Jesus, may never suffer us to be lost, for we are his children, and he is almighty, all wisdom, and all love, and there is none but he. Blessed may he be. So Jesus is a very maternal figure. And this gets me to the next point. Jesus is very, very human in these visions. Julian wants us to realize that Christ is human like one of us, because he assumed our nature. And so she will even talk about Christ going to the bathroom, which is one of the more interesting images of God in this book. She spends a lot of time meditating on Christ's wounds, which was part of the spirituality of the High Middle Ages. There should be perhaps a warning on this book that it gets very, very graphic. She thinks about the pain that Christ must have suffered with the crown of thorns, the gash in his side, the nails in his hands, his feet. Lots of very graphic description, but it's also extremely human. Because for Julian, what is so amazing is that God became human, and therefore we can love all humanity and recognize all of humanity as participating in the divine. And finally, there's the Augustinian, the theological content of this book. And it is somewhat of a modification, because Augustine places a lot of emphasis on God's wrath, but Julian places the emphasis rather on God's mercy, on the fact that despite how sinful humans are, God has mercy. And that even Adam's sin can be a really good thing, which reminds us a lot of the exultant. O happy fault of Adam. O necessary sin of Adam. Why? Because it brought us salvation, because Christ came to save humanity from sin. And what's amazing is that God became human. God would not have become human if Adam had not sinned. And Julian picks up this theme to say that yes, perhaps sin is necessary, but all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. That is the most famous line in the revelation of love. Julian also talks about how sin is a lack. Sin is not an actual thing, it's a lack of goodness. The emphasis being on grace. And that's what makes this book so subversive. It's why it's surprising that those who were after Wycliffe and his followers, the Lollards, did not go after this book. They didn't even know about its existence, perhaps. Although she was very popular in the late Middle Ages, and is still popular today. It's because she always emphasizes human impotence, and the human inability to act, but that it's God who acts instead, the emphasis being on grace. And this emphasis on grace existed in Wycliffe's writing, who kind of returned to the grace-centered, even predestination-centered spirituality of Augustine. So Julian's work is really valuable for anybody who's interested in medieval spirituality. I definitely recommend it. Even if you're not particularly religious yourself, I think it is definitely a change from what is generally presented as medieval spirituality. There's a lot of feminine imagery, it's very comforting, and I hope to make more videos like this about other really important pieces in the Middle Ages. Thank you, everybody. Bye now.